All right, I'm going to get us going since we only have 50 minutes together today. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Sampson. I am one of the co-leads for the Community Engagement Core of the M-LEEaD Center. So thanks for being here. Today's topic that you've tuned in for is Understanding NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, Non-attainment, Science, Policy, and Implications for Environmental Justice. So this is part of a resident and researcher series where we bring together folks to discuss a wide range of environmental health and justice issues. You may have caught some of these in the past. We can share the link for those of you who haven't. We cover topics such as flooding, occupational health, waste management issues, a wide variety. We do this, as I mentioned, as part of the Michigan Center on Life Stage Environmental Exposures and Disease, also known as M-LEEaD, the M-LEEaD Center, and we want to recognize funding from the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. So today's topic emerged out of discussions among M-LEED's stakeholder advocacy board. So this is a group of leaders from health agencies, grassroots, and regional nonprofit organizations. And together, the SAB works to try to strengthen that dialogue between scientists, community, policymakers, and really try to understand the interests and priorities of community when it comes to environmental health and justice. So as many of you know, the Clean Air Act is one of our primary federal air quality laws. It's been very influential for the last 50, 60 years or so. Initially enacted in 1963. It's very complicated. There's many titles. There's many components to it. We're going to try to work today to demystify it and talk about what we could be doing better with the Clean Air Act to ensure environmental justice. So we keep these quick. As I mentioned, we have now 46 minutes. So we're going to try our hardest to keep about 10 to 15 minutes at the end so we can have some dialogue. Please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll be tracking on that. I'll start off by telling you who we have with us today. We're going to start with Simone Sagovac, who has been a 30-plus year Detroit resident. She served as project director for Southwest Detroit Community Benefits Coalition since 2008. This is a coalition that has worked for quality of life and health protections with development of the Gordie Howe International Bridge to Canada, and it has secured millions of dollars in programs for residents by working with many different partners. She's worked to develop health surveys, air and truck monitoring programs, policies for air quality, environmental justice, and equitable development. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Simone, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And Allison, thank you for starting the slides. So good afternoon. I'm going to take you first to a place where the air isn't good, to Southwest Detroit. Our air that we breathe is different. Much of this is due to zoning that put industry in certain locations and not others, and that continues today. I visited Seattle recently, and it felt intoxicating to just breathe the air there. And it really made me think that what we are breathing here isn't what air is supposed to be for human health. So I'm going to show you some slides here. Southwest Detroit is a very diverse, very densely populated, multi-ethnic place. And next, people spend their lives the way everybody does, except they're spending it with a lot of pollution and a lot of industry. Next, this activity of living with industry has become really normalized for people. So things that look very startling to others when they come visit the community are just a fact of everyday life. Next. Southwest Detroit is home to what many have heard about, the 48217 zip code, one of the most polluted in the state of Michigan and one of the higher polluted zip codes in the country. And this is a slide showing how close we live with this industry. We're a home directly across from the Marathon oil refinery, and we have the state's only oil refinery with Marathon in Southwest Detroit. Next. We have Zug Island, the home of DTE Energy and U.S. Steel, both coal-fired power plants. And Zug Island, you've got families living directly across the street, and this is the view that those residents have of the steel mill. Next. We have multiple incompatible land uses in Southwest Detroit. And again, this is very normalized. So we've got the freeways, railroads, trucking that's coming for all the industries, oil refining, the steel and auto, and more. Next. And homes stranded next to these developments are really considered the environmental injustice that we have, the great environmental justice. Next. This is a grid showing the two different things intertwined, industry in purple and residential surrounding and intertwined with that industry. This was done by Professor Larissa Larson at U of M. Next. And this slide, I just came upon a resident who was routinely washing the exterior of her house in Delray. Soot is a huge problem for us. It comes from many sources. And of course, this is what we're breathing. It's inside and outside our homes. Next. I don't know what the garbage trucks look like in your community or recycling trucks, but this is a resident just snapped this recently, driving behind a Green for Life truck. Nice irony there. One of the contractors working for the city. Next. And this is a street sweeper truck. Wish I could show you the video of it because this truck was fully engulfed in the dirt from the street that it was supposedly doing something positive about. And so even the technology that we use to try to solve the problems is not helping in our community. This was from a contractor working for the Gordie Howe National Bridge. Next. Thanks, Allison. So the health of our air is based on federal standards for different pollutants and how concentrated they are in the air. They're measured by air monitors placed in certain counties, and the average readings of monitors across a county is the ambient air condition for that county. Not every regulated toxin is monitored. That depends on the need determined and on funding. It's important to note that when you take the average across a county, there are areas where pollution is high, and that gets diluted when you average air over the whole county. And it makes it seem like the air condition in Livonia or Canton in Wayne County is the same as the air in Detroit or Southwest Detroit, where we have the greatest concentration of polluting industries and also diesel truck traffic associated with those industries and our border crossing to Canada. For each pollutant, there's a level of human exposure that is considered to be too high to be protective of human health. This is guided by our Federal Clean Air Act, which is now over 50 years old. The state of Michigan is supposed to be responsible to maintain the levels of each pollutant to protect human health. The total or cumulative effect of all air pollutants or toxins together does not need to be considered currently. So you could have very high levels of each pollutant, and so long as one wasn't over the limit, the air would be considered an attainment. And many air toxins aren't required to be monitored at all. When any pollutant concentration in the air does rise above the federally allowed concentration level for that pollutant, the area or county is considered to be a non-attainment. Even though conditions are diluted, the ambient air in Wayne County has been a non-attainment consistently for over 15 years. Meaning the levels set to guard or protect human health have been violated or exceeded. So every day for 15 years has been unhealthy in Wayne County, and it has been especially unhealthy in Southwest Detroit and other places where the pollution is emitted. This is a snapshot of what has been over the limit of human harm in Wayne County. Wayne County was a non-attainment for PM 2.5, or small particulate matter, continuously for 8 years from 2005 until 2012. Then we became a non-attainment for sulfur dioxide starting in 2013 and ongoing through today, so 10 years and counting. Simultaneously, we went into non-attainment for ozone in 2018, and that is ongoing now for 5 years. Our community is left wondering, how is this system really protecting us? When an area reaches non-attainment, it is supposed to trigger a process to get us back into attainment. SEMCOG, a regional quasi-government organization, is responsible for coordinating the attainment process for Michigan, where they identify sources of pollution that need to be reduced from what industry emitters, and they develop a plan for effective reductions. It's called a State Implementation Plan, or a SIP. When we were in non-attainment for PM 2.5, for example, the steel mills were identified as the main sources of the problem, and they were required to install additional filtration at their facilities. This process took years. Communities living daily with unhealthy air need improvements to our system. While we have been in consistent non-attainment and daily harm from our air for 15 years, permitting for industries has continued, even when the same pollutant is involved. When a new federal clean air standard is being planned for, it is known in advance which counties will become in non-attainment once it's enacted. Our system should be proactively identifying these areas and solutions and begin implementation before ever arriving at harmful non-attainment air levels. If other circumstances are pushing areas into non-attainment, like high economic activity or so higher industry output, those who monitor the air monitors can see the levels rising over time, and again, plans can be put into place and actions taken before reaching the legal harm limits. In addition to more strictly adhering to our legal air levels for harm, there also needs to be transparency. and proactive communication with the affected communities about what is happening to us. There need to be significant guardrails and consequences for all parties engaged in the compliance system if and when we arrive at non-attainment. The daily and lifelong damages to health aren't fully quantifiable for families, and there are scarce penalties for the pollution and harm. Since we have an understanding of levels that cause harm, why are we allowing them to be exceeded? When new standards are passed to achieve better air quality by law, all citizens are supposed to benefit equally under the law, but that isn't happening. We need to ask, why are we spending to monitor our air when then not acting on the findings to protect health? The system is flawed. We need to measure and understand our air at the census tract level. Then we could respond and direct resources more appropriately to get adjustments from industries, even in the permitting process and before ever getting to non-attainment. Our attainment system and current process is causing harm, especially for communities where many pollutants are released. We should all be taking actions as if we were living in these communities. The goal of our air monitoring isn't the data, but to monitor air in a way to help us make good decisions, to keep us from reaching levels of public harm. We do have choices under current laws to better measure air quality and prevent reaching non-attainment to improve health and quality of life for many Michigan families. Thanks for considering all that is possible to make needed improvements.
Thank you, Simone, for giving us the context and reminding us why these policies exist or should exist and how they could be improved. So we're going to hand over next to Stuart Batterman, who is a professor of environmental health sciences, global public health, and water resources and environmental engineering at University of Michigan. His research and teaching addresses environmental impact assessment, human exposure, and health risk assessment and environmental management. He applies this research to contemporary issues, including ambient and indoor air quality, environmental epidemiology, policy analysis, and many other topics. So, Stuart, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Natalie. Let me share my screen. Can you see this? Okay, super. So I have just a few minutes, but I want to cover 100 years, the situation in 50 states, build off what Simone has said, and so forth. So it's tough. I think the key points that I want to start off with are sometimes really nicely introduced when we're together by showing you some old pictures. And I like to ask folks, where is this? When is this? This is the Detroit waterfront about 100 years ago. If we move forward in time 50 years, it doesn't look all that much different, even in the 1980s. Moving another 50 years, we see a big change. And a lot of those plumes are gone. A lot of the skies air is cleaned up. But as Simone just pointed out, there's lots of issues left. And she highlighted the refinery. There's some facilities like Detroit Industrial Generation, which is kind of hidden behind homes, but it's a major power plant and lots of truck traffic and so forth. So, the point today is to talk about the role of science with the NAAQS, with strategies to reach attainment with the NAAQS, and I want to provide some background and perspectives on this. So to start off with, really, the enabling legislation was the Clean Air Act and its amendments dating from 1970 and 1990. And what we're talking about is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and they have a couple of very important aspects to them. Their basis is to protect the most sensitive cohort. Costs are not a consideration. Attainability and technological feasibility are not relevant to their determination. And the standards should hit the mark. They should be neither more nor less stringent than necessary. This is what the Clean Air Act says, and it's not zero risk, but it's definitely health-based, it's broadly applicable, it's technology forcing and uniform standards. That's the law. Now, the science and the standards are complex, as you've heard. The science involved in setting the NAAQS are some of the issues are listed here. We want to have the toxicology, the exposure, the epidemiology. We want to have the science supporting that. And that's really critical. There's lots of other factors that come into play in setting the standards, and some of those are listed on the slide. It includes a number of factors, including justice considerations come into play, and we're starting to see that a little bit now with the proposed revisions to the PM standards, the PM 2.5 standards. But ultimately, in addition to the science, the NAAQS are set as a public welfare policy judgment. Science feeds into that, but it's not even the main determinant. It's really a public welfare policy. The process for setting the NAAQS is depicted here. This is coming out of PM 2.5 rules that are being developed. This is approximately a 10-year process. The NAAQS, for example, have been reviewed. I believe this is the 5th time for PM. And, clearly there's a lot going in here to this process. The science comes forth in the peer-reviewed studies that feed into the integrated science assessment, which comes up with a review of the literature, which is, I have to say, just massive. For example, for PM 2.5, that feeds into what the agency ultimately decides. And again, this is a process which is scripted by EPA, and we're in the midst of this right now for PM 2.5. Okay, so what do the NAAQS look like? The NAAQS controls 6 pollutants. They are listed here on the left. There are short-term and long-term standards that are not to be exceeded with respect to a certain statistical form that's described here. These are largely combustion-related pollutants like carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, particles, and sulfur dioxide. We have one secondary pollutant, ozone, which is formed in the atmosphere from precursors, volatile organic compounds, and nitrogen dioxide. We have particulate lead here, which is not necessarily combustion related, but it's one of the toxic pollutants that we are concerned about. The standards are expressed as a threshold. Achieving this concentration means that you are not in compliance. Exceeding this concentration means that you are in non-attainment. The form of these standards has remained remarkably stable since about the early 70s when the Clean Air Act came into existence. As I mentioned, the PM standard is being reconsidered. There is discussion to lower this in the 8 to 10 range. There is also discussion in the proposed rules to address some environmental justice considerations by requiring additional monitoring in EJ communities. Now, looking at what that would mean, this is a map showing areas of the country that would not meet the PM 2.5 limit of 10, which is one of the numbers being considered. And that's 50 counties. If it got lowered to 9, 112 counties would not meet it. Currently, most of the country meets the PM 2.5 limit of 12, except for some areas in central California. Ozone got its own NAAQS. There are about 100 areas that do not achieve the ozone standard. They're listed here. And the third pollutant where exceedances are somewhat common is SO2, but here there's only about 20 areas, and you can see little blue dots through some of the areas which do not meet the SO2 standard. As Simone pointed out, Detroit would not meet the NAAQS for PM 2.5 if they're lowered to 10. It currently does not meet the ozone standard, although the state has a petition to waive or to get into attainment based on recent trends, and it does not meet SO2 standard, but again, the state has a petition to EPA based on recent monitoring data. Each of these pollutants is considered independently. There's no cumulative impact. But the EPA does put together presentations like this showing that about 100 million people live in areas where one or more of the NAAQS is not attained. Most commonly, it's it's ozone, followed by PM. Okay, let's look locally at Detroit. As Simone has very nicely pointed out, historically, there have been many challenges with air quality, out of compliance currently with SO2, ozone, and as I mentioned, the proposed PM 2.5 standards. This has occurred for a number of reasons. We're an industrial city in Detroit. We have many pollutant sources. There's been relatively little investment in new technology and emission controls. These are legacy facilities. Some of them are ancient. On top of that, the impacts can be potentially large due to the large exposed and vulnerable population. And I think that there are many opportunities to improve the situation. Here I'm showing you the existing Ambassador Bridge, which approximately 10,000 trucks cross daily. Below is Zug Island, where coal and coke and iron and steel are processed, and this is a large facility right on the river. The impact of this, we've looked at in a number of ways with health impact studies, with risk studies. Approximately 7% of deaths in Wayne County are attributed to pollutants, air pollutants. This is not too different from sort of the burden of disease throughout the rest of the country, but it's somewhat worse due to the greater susceptibility and vulnerability of folks in Detroit for a number of different reasons that are highlighted on the slide. Now, we understand major point sources. This is a map showing sources that emit at least 100 tons per year, which classifies them as a major point source. This map shows a concentration around Zug Island, the river area here, but it's really distributed throughout the city. And this map also shows monitoring sites as these little red dots, and they are used in part with modeling to determine non-compliance with the standards. And a couple of these sites are critical because they are the ones that showed non-attainment with sulfur dioxide, with ozone, and that would show non-attainment with PM. Looking at SO2 in a little more detail and blowing that map up a bit, the non-attainment region is depicted in this green area here. This is based on the contributions of SO2 from the named industrial facilities here that collectively emit about 39,000 tons of SO2 per year. And EGLE defined this area as the non-attainment area for sulfur dioxide. So when you have non-attainment, what do you do about it? I think Nick will talk more about this, but essentially the Clean Air Act mandates a state implementation plan which is designed to solve the air quality problem within 5 years. This typically includes characterizing the problem, development of a control strategy, demonstrating that that control strategy will work by attaining the standards, and then the rules and practices and administrative requirements to ensure that this actually happens. This is a part of the science that goes into this, is coming up with the sources that contribute to the air quality problem. This is a recent analysis that we did for PM 2.5. It shows that mobile sources, cars, trucks, construction equipment, things like this, contribute about 41% of the PM. Secondary pollutants, which are nitrate and sulfate, contribute collectively about another 40 or so percent. So to bring the area into compliance for PM 2.5, it would make sense to focus on the major contributors to PM 2.5. And so this is one of the sort of source apportionment techniques that would be used to help develop a control strategy. This is the tip of the iceberg. EPA has a new document called a lean development for the SIP, the State Implementation Plan. just to scare you a little bit, it's got a checklist which continues over 3 pages of things that must be done by the state or SEMCOG or whatever entity is responsible for coming into compliance. And so that checklist starts off here with a bunch of acronyms and so forth that depend on the pollutant that you're looking at, but it includes basically developing the emissions inventory, the modeling, the contingency assessment, and so forth, schedule to come into compliance. This continues on a couple more pages. It's very complicated, especially for ozone, because this is a pollutant that is a secondary pollutant produced from those precursors, and continues further and further. You know, in prepping for this talk, the three of us decided we could share things like the plain English language or a guide to the Clean Air Act, but in fact, this itself is pretty complicated as well, but it does explain some of these terms. Okay, to close out, I want to emphasize again, the NAAQS are health-based, technology forcing, intended to be reasonably protective of public health and the environment. It should address both chronic and acute exposures. But the standards are complicated. They're revised periodically, but they evolve only very slowly. Some of the limitations that we can highlight and are the fact that the NAAQS address only 6 of the many thousands of air pollutants that are out there, and they only address one at a time, so there's no cumulative impact. They're threshold-based, although we really don't believe that this is a good model, especially for things like PM. They lag the science. The process that I showed you of developing the standards has lots of opportunities for lags in it, and we are at the point now where we can start talking about different types of effect sizes for different cohorts of the populations, and this promises to really change those estimates for the impacts that I showed you in Detroit considerably, considering the large minority population. The compliance determinations use, I guess, data that I would characterize as imperfect or sparse in terms of its spatial and temporal coverage. And in non-attainment decisions, in terms of what to do about non-attainment, there is the input from engineering and science used to assess source contributions and controls, but there's also considerable uncertainty, and we're looking forward for a number of years, and that increases the uncertainty as well. So I'll conclude, it's not just science, but science is the critical input, but it's, again, a judgment on public welfare policy. I'll stop sharing and turn it back to Natalie.
Thank you, Stuart. And I'll just remind folks to feel free to start using that Q&A so we can get some questions rolling. Last but certainly not least, we have Nick Leonard, who is the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. In his role, he supervises the center's attorneys and coordinates the organization's legal strategies. He worked as an Equal Justice Works Fellow there first, and I will hand it off to you, Nick, to talk about everything you do and how it relates.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm going to try to build off both Simone and Stuart by talking about how the Clean Air Act sort of gives life to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And basically, I'm going to try to touch on a couple of points, sort of how essentially we measure for compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and sort of the gaps in sort of that process and the gaps in sort of the non-attainment process. But I'm also going to try to touch on how the Clean Air Act addresses new sources that want to come into these areas and what are the requirements for essentially the issuance of permits to new sources to ensure that they won't cause or contribute to a violation of a national ambient air quality standard. But I'll start off by pointing out that I think Stuart did a good job of highlighting the limits of national ambient air quality standards. So there's no cumulative assessment. So say you have 2 areas, you have an area that's out of it, that's failing to meet 2 national ambient air quality standards. It's more or less irrelevant from a regulatory perspective, which I think is a key gap in how those standards operate. And as Stuart mentioned, we're only here talking about six pollutants out of a world of really countless air pollutants. But let's start with how monitors measure for essentially compliance with the pollutants, then we'll move to the sort of permitting program. So, generally how we determine whether or not an area is sort of meeting the National Ambient Air Quality Standard is looking to sort of a network of air monitoring stations that the state is required to set up across the state. But, there's a limited number of these air monitoring stations across the state. For ozone, there's 26 ozone monitors all across the state. About 6 are in sort of the Metro Detroit area. For PM 2.5, there's 23 monitors located throughout the state. And then for sulfur dioxide, there's 9 monitors throughout the state. Now those monitors are basically meant to ensure that air quality throughout the state of Michigan is meeting the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, that everybody basically has air to breathe that's not above, that doesn't have pollution above those standards. Now, if one of those monitors basically does detect air pollution at concentrations above the standard, that triggers those non-attainment requirements that Stuart was mentioning. And that's more or less boils down to the state of Michigan, that it has to develop a plan for how it's going to lower air pollution and basically get air pollution at the monitor that's been above the standard now below the standard. And once they do that, once the data is basically lowered below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, then they can basically go back to the EPA and say, hey, we think we're meeting the standard again, and we want to be designated back to attainment. And that designation is really important, not only because the plan that the state has to develop to lower pollution, but also for in a non-attainment area, there's more stringent permit requirements that would apply to any new source that wants to locate in that area. So, right now there's sort of a 7-county ozone non-attainment area. Any new source that's going to come in there into that 7-county area is going to basically have to comply with more stringent permitting requirements than they would otherwise be required to. And this is something that industry is very cognizant of and typically tries very hard to avoid. I want to highlight just a few gaps in sort of this area of sort of monitoring for compliance and then moving from attainment to non-attainment and back to attainment. First, there's commonly long delays in sort of the non-attainment designation process. So say you have a monitor that detects air pollution above an air quality standard, such as, well, we'll use ozone as an example, because the Detroit area had several monitors above the ozone standard, and when the standard was lowered in 2015. You may think like, right when that happens, new requirements kick in. Typically not the case. In Michigan, we saw a nearly 3-year delay between essentially detecting ozone concentrations above the standard and that formal designation of the non-attainment area for ozone. And so, that's important to note, because in that time period, you saw industry basically rushing to get permits in so that they could avoid that more stringent permitting regime that would be kicked in once the non-attainment designation is finalized. You also see the state often trying to exclude data due to what are called exceptional events. So we've seen this in the Detroit area with ozone pollution, essentially the state trying to exclude high ozone days from being considered in how they calculate compliance with the ozone standard, saying that ozone concentrations at the East 7 Mile monitor in Detroit were influenced by wildfire smoke from northern Canada. And so in that situation, it's not necessarily that, it's not the case that community residents aren't breathing polluted air. They are. The ozone levels are above the standard, but it's basically the state saying they shouldn't be held legally responsible for lowering those pollution levels because it's been caused by something out of their control. Ozone is a particularly interesting case because the Michigan's going to be coming back and asking to basically redesignate the 7-county area in Southeast Michigan from non-attainment to attainment based on it's excluding that data, as I mentioned. But the legal standard for demonstrating that is the reductions in ozone pollution have to be permanent and due to enforceable measures that the state has taken. And, especially given the earliest ozone action days that we've ever seen in Southeast Michigan in recent days, just last week, there's big questions as to, how permanent and how enforceable are our ozone reductions. I want to touch a little bit on now how news sources have to demonstrate compliance with national ambient air quality standards, because I think this is the other big part of how this standard is, how national ambient air quality standards are brought to life. And essentially, each news source that wants to get a permit to construct a new facility or modify an existing facility has to demonstrate that their emissions won't cause or contribute to a violation of an air quality standard. And this is typically done through sort of essentially a two-part analysis. First, they predict impacts from the news source. So they say, we estimate we're going to emit this amount of pollution and it's going to cause this impact in the community. It's going to cause this concentration of air pollution. And then they also have to look at background levels of air pollution. So they have to establish background levels both by using sort of air modeling analysis as well as air quality monitoring data from what's supposed to be monitors that are nearby the source. But as I just mentioned, typically when a permit applicant is looking to gather air monitoring data for this purpose, they're looking to use data from the state's existing air monitoring network. And as I mentioned at the outset, there's a limited number of these monitors. So in particular, when we get into communities that don't have a ton of air monitors, it's quite common for permit applicants to use monitors that are located very far from the proposed source to basically establish a local level of air quality in the community where they're planning to develop. And this came up recently in a case I was working on. There's a plan to build a hot mix asphalt plant in Genesee Township near Flint, and to basically establish local air quality levels for a couple of pollutants. They used monitors in Lansing and in Grand Rapids. And so I think there's from our perspective, key questions there as to basically, is that data essentially relevant? Is it establishing background levels of air pollution in Genesee Township? And quite frankly, we don't think so, and it's an issue that we've been working quite a bit on. And so, in short, there are a lot of gaps in sort of how these standards are brought to life. The system is there, and we've certainly been pushing the state to, I think, do a better job and make sure that they're essentially protecting residents. Even if it's perfectly implemented, there are those gaps, as Stuart mentioned. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie.
Thanks, Nick. There are some questions coming in, and questions that I think we've all grappled with, but maybe you can shed some light to our folks listening in. So why can Michigan remain in non-attainment beyond 5 years without action or legal implications? You sort of alluded to this, but if you could maybe say a bit more, particularly sulfur dioxide being the example here.
Yeah, well, there is legal action is the short answer. Typically states have to come back into compliance within 3 years. And sulfur dioxide, and so Michigan has faced lawsuits regarding their lengthy non-attainment for sulfur dioxide. And so it's there. It's honestly just sort of like a poor substitute for the state taking timely action because the harm has already occurred. And the remedy is typically like setting schedules for the state to do things by. And so, there has been legal action. What the state has done there is basically violating the Clean Air Act. The remedy isn't as strong as it should be.
Yeah, let me add one point. Standards over time have come down. Unsurprising to anybody who understands the ability to detect adverse health effects with pollutants. The Clean Air Act is structured so it looks forward. And so what this means is that the 2010 revision in the SO2 standard essentially caused part of Michigan, I showed you, to come out of non-attainment. It's come out of attainment into non-attainment. Levels of SO2 had been many times higher in the past. And there's no consideration of that when we look at enforcement and determinations with the NAAQS. And so that harm is just not considered anymore. And we only look to see what is moving forward. The other point with SO2 is I have not seen in the country a concentration of coal-fired facilities in an urban area that did not have any modern pollution controls. And these old facilities, we call them legacy facilities, are essentially grandmothered under the Clean Air Act and have a much less stringent set of requirements than the new source review program that Nick mentioned. And so we treat old facilities differently from new facilities in this regard.
Thanks, Stuart. So not surprisingly, there's questions about compliance, and I'm guessing enforcement of this. So how are compliance policies enforced? And then also another layer of this is kind of what is the role of industry lobbyists in all of this policy making and enforcement? Nope, unmute Nick.
Compliance policies are typically enforced in sort of one of two ways. First, there's the role of sort of the EPA, essentially, when Michigan misses its deadlines to basically submit a non-attainment, any part of its non-attainment submittal. And Stuart sort of laid out what's required in those submittals is typically long and complex. And so it's not uncommon for states to essentially miss something. The ultimate enforcement power for the EPA in that context is to basically issue sanctions regarding highway funding. And in fact, this is something that recently came up with the sulfur dioxide issue. Michigan was sort of right up against facing sanctions for basically their longstanding missing of sulfur dioxide deadlines regarding their non-attainment submittals. And so they just snuck in a conditional submittal just before the deadline for their sanctions clock, which temporarily stayed it in sort of recent weeks. And so that's sort of the EPA's authority there. But like I said, there's oftentimes ways for the states to sort of wiggle out of that. Then on the private side, private organizations, private individuals can come and basically bring lawsuits to compel the EPA to sort of basically require the state to adhere to deadlines. Because oftentimes what you see is, the EPA sort of not being strict enforcers of those deadlines, letting states sort of miss deadlines. And so that's often a place of concern for advocates. And I mean, in terms of lobbying, I mean, it plays a very prominent role throughout the process in terms of setting the standard, that gap in terms of when there's a exceedance of a standard to actually setting the non-attainment designation, there's significant lobbying there. There's significant lobbying to move from non-attainment to attainment throughout this process, essentially.
Yeah, I would add that in developing rules and permits, the regulatory agencies work very closely with industry. They feel their goal is to facilitate industry often as compared to, say, public health concerns. That said, they still want to achieve the clean air standards and goals, but often it's a question of just hitting the mark, not doing anything moving too aggressively. This is because they operate in a political landscape, and the governor, the top politicians are concerned about industry and jobs, and there's still a perception that there's a trade-off with the environment. And I think when you look at the total impact, the costs and so forth, the quality of life, desirability of location, their calculus is incomplete. And so part of our job, I think, is to bring this awareness and to get a more comprehensive assessment.
The last question up here is, I see a few more actually. There's some many. So aren't there already cumulative impact rules on the books? Can we talk a little bit about that? And I think as we get to the last few minutes too, if folks can comment on, I think it can be really frustrating as advocates or as residents of feeling like, where are the policy levers? Where do I put my energy in this complicated process? So I think if you could weigh in on that, and we can certainly follow up on some of these other questions if we run out of time. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, Simone or Nick, go ahead.
I think I suppose it varies based on what you mean when you say cumulative impacts. And so if your sort of concept of cumulative impacts is thinking how do different pollutants interact together, say like different types of air pollution, or say like air pollution and different types of pollution from other environmental media like air pollution, water pollution, drinking water pollution, those kinds of things, then I mean, the short answer is, not really, not in the strict sense. What the national ambient air quality standards do is kind of set a cumulative impact rule for just one pollutant. So it says like, we're going to make sure that all of the sources that emit, say, sulfur dioxide aren't resulting in levels of sulfur dioxide pollution in our communities above a certain threshold. And so it's cumulative in the sense that it's trying to consider all different sources of that pollutant, of that single, one pollutant, but it's not cumulative in the sense of it's not looking at, well, what about sulfur dioxide pollution in addition to particulate matter pollution in the air, and in addition to lead pollution in our water and in our homes, things of that nature.
So that act on that policy lever question is kind of sprinkled throughout these, and I think it's a good one to wrap up on. If any advice to those of us who want to make sure these protections are addressing environmental injustice?
I mean, I think the key policy lever is just, as I've mentioned, just sort of watchdogging, sort of monitoring data, and as it moves from compliance to non-compliance and back to compliance, each of those stages involves like a lot of steps and a lot of room for state agencies and federal agencies to abuse those steps, to issue extensions, to basically make determinations that an area is back in attainment when maybe it's not, or when maybe it'll go back to non-attainment very soon. And there's obviously room to exclude data, which always presents problems, which always presents questions. And then, looking at news sources really hard and saying, like, how are they saying that this news source won't cause or contribute to a violation of an air quality standard? And what data are they relying on to use that? What kind of analysis are they relying on to make that demonstration? I think in my experience, throughout sort of in all of those different sort of places of advocacy, that the state's not doing as much as I would like. They're not sort of being as protective as I would like. They're still more tilted towards sort of industry concerns. And so that there's a lot to work on there.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I would say that legal venues are certainly one opportunity to provide for more stringent compliance with the intent and the practice of the Clean Air Act. It's also interesting in thinking about sort of public awareness and action with respect to participation in hearings, and this is always helpful. And if there is controversy about a permit application, the state will hold a public hearing, and it's not certainly guaranteed that much will happen, but it's a venue to express opportunities, and that application will get more consideration than a hearing which is buried. And lastly, I think that one of the things which is happening, which is quite exciting, is the advent of community operated and deployed sensors or monitors. And you heard the speakers talk about the gap in monitoring data, and that is important. These low-cost sensors can kind of fill in some of the gaps. They are not used for compliance determinations, but they are providing information which we yet don't know how it's going to affect the regulatory process. And but this is, I think, another possibility. And the state and feds are considering how to utilize this information.
Thanks, Stuart. I know we have to wrap this up. I want to see, Simone, if you have anything else you want to share. I know we did not answer all the questions. There's so many questions, but it sounds like we need to have a part 2.
So I guess one thing to point out is that the communities that are affected by this, that are believing that the air monitoring is adding up to something, are begging for air monitoring, a lot of people don't realize that the level of protection that's supposed to be maintained isn't. And like no one really understands why we're allowed to be going on in this non-attainment for 10 years. And so there definitely needs to be more direct communication with the communities. And I think that there are opportunities that even within this system, the system that isn't doing the cumulative impacts as we think they should be, there are opportunities where they could begin the solution steps sooner to keep us from it. I mean, that was what I had said in the beginning, but I feel like it's worth mentioning that they can see it coming. We've heard that from the professionals that are monitoring the monitors. So we could do a lot of justice and protect a lot of people's health if we were to, even using the system we have, just begin the process sooner. So I think that there are solutions yet untapped, and anybody who's listening that has a role in that process, I think that people can all work together and those things are possible for us.
Thanks, Simone. And I know I see Teresa Landrum's throwing in some really good questions and insights that, again, I think we're going to have a part 2 here and bring more folks into the mix. So thank you, everyone. I know we're past time, but I appreciate everyone being here. And please check out the recording or share it afterwards. And yeah, take care, everyone.